Okay, here we go. Topic number 1 of Unit 3 and 4 PE for 2018. So first topic is classification of movement skills. So essentially what we're going to look at in this first few weeks of the course is how do we classify different movement skills that are used in sport? Why would we classify them? And how exactly do we classify them? And essentially, how can we use that knowledge to help improve skills? If we're classifying movement skills, essentially we're working to 3 different criteria. So we can classify a skill based on the precision of the movement involved in the skill. So that's what we're talking about, fine motor skills or gross motor skills. We can classify the skill depending on the type of the movement that's involved. So is it a discrete movement, a serial movement, or is it a continuous motor skill? And we can also classify a movement skill based on how predictable the environment is in which the skill is executed. So is it an open motor skill or is it a closed motor skill? The reason we would go to the trouble of looking at a skill, pulling it apart and trying to put it into one or more of these categories, because some skills do go across all 3 of the categories, would essentially be if we're a coach and we're trying to help improve an individual, a performer's skill level, we want to be able to evaluate their ability to perform that skill. And to do that, you need to have a bit of a criteria to evaluate it against. We need to be able to plan sessions, coaching, training sessions that enable the performer to develop their skills. And to do that, we need to know what's involved, the different characteristics of the skills we're trying to develop, so that we can include appropriate activities to do it. And we want to be giving feedback to the performer to help them know where their errors are and how to perfect them. And to do that, we need to have, once again, some sort of criteria that we're referring to. So that is why we go off this criteria here: movement precision, type of the movement, predictability of the environment, and we'll unpack those a little bit more over the next few slides. If we're classifying based on movement precision, we can take a skill and we can essentially divide them up into being a fine motor skill or a gross motor skill. So what we're referring to is how precise the movement is. So if it's a fine motor skill, you've got a really precise movement where the precision is quite important in executing the skill. So for example, if you're doing your bounces of the tennis ball before you're serving, you want to be pretty precise as to where you're dropping the ball, the height you're catching it at. If you're throwing a dart, of course, you want to be quite precise as to where you're aiming. Putting in golf, all of those skills are affected by how precisely you execute them. And they're all controlled by only a small group of muscles. So what we say is fine motor skills, they recruit smaller muscles that are associated with finer movements. That's opposed to our gross motor skills. So with our gross motor skills, that's a motor skill where the precision of its execution is not as important as what it might be with a fine motor skill. So these are our things like our running, our swimming, weightlifting as a few examples. Skills where you're recruiting a pretty large muscle group or pretty large muscle groups in executing the actual skill. In terms of the type of movement, we have 3 categories that we use to compare our different types of movement involved in a particular skill. So we have discrete skills, serial skills, or what we call continuous skills. So if it's a discrete skill, and think of that word discrete, it's something that has a very clear beginning to it and a very clear end. So it's a movement that's sort of like almost like one movement, and you know when it starts and you know when it stops. So if you pass a netball, a chest pass from one person to another, that's a discrete skill. You start the movement with the ball at your chest, the movement's completed when the ball leaves your hands. Same as kicking a ball. You start the skill as the ball hits your foot, you finish the skill as you've kicked it, throwing a ball. So discrete skills, clear beginning, clear end. A serial skill is just a number of discrete skills performed in a sequence. So for example, if you take the tennis serve You've got the discrete skill of bouncing the ball. You might have the discrete skill of squatting down with your legs, discrete skill of throwing the ball up in the air, a discrete skill of a backswing, then a foreswing, and then making contact with the ball. So you've got sort of 5 or 6 discrete skills all performed in a particular sequence. So we call it a serial motor skill. So discrete, clear beginning and an end. Serial, a number of discrete skills linked together in a particular sequence. And then we have our last category, which is a continuous skill. And this is the sort of skill where you almost don't know where it starts and stops. So if you're running, for example, you might perform in a 100-meter race. So it has a start and a finish, but we say there's sort of like an arbitrary beginning and end point. We've assigned a beginning and end point to a particular event, but the skill itself of running is something that's occurring continuously throughout that distance. So running doesn't have a clear start of when you start to run and when you finish to run in terms of the skill of turning your legs over to run. So discrete, serial, continuous. Perhaps one of the most important classifications of skills, particularly when it comes to coaching and helping people develop their ability to perform a particular skill, is the predictability of the environment. So under this banner, we divide skills into closed motor skills or open motor skills. And saying divide is probably not completely correct because it's really hard to say you're just a closed skill, you're just an open skill. It works on a continuum, like our picture down the bottom here. You have closed skills at one end, open skills at the other, and every skill you look at is going to fall somewhere along that continuum. And essentially we're saying this skill in the middle, it's sort of half open and half closed to a degree. So a closed motor skill, this is a skill that when a performer executes the skill, that performer is in a really stable environment, a predictable environment, and they're in control of the pace in which the skill is being executed. So we say they've got the greatest level of control over the environment they're performing in. So the weather is stable and consistent, the playing surface is stable and consistent. In terms of opposition, you essentially wouldn't have an opposition because you can't control the movements of an opposition. So closed environments don't really have that. Good examples are darts, diving, a basketball free throw. If you think of those 3 things, there's nobody impacting that skill execution other than the person performing the skill themselves. An open motor skill is your most common sort of skills in your team sports. Anything with an opposition is really open motor skill environment. So we say in this environment, the performer has less control over their environment. The conditions they're performing in are less predictable. The environment is constantly changing. So if you're making a tackle in rugby, you've got the person running at you, they might have support players, they might be able to step, they might be able to run faster, run slower, pass the ball. Digging in volleyball, you don't have as much control as to where the ball is going to. Dribbling a hockey ball, once again, you've got opposition coming at you, which will be influencing your ability to sort of dribble around the field. When we're in our next topic, we're going to look at practice or training or developing skills. And what we'll talk about is that even some of these skills that are open motor skills, sometimes when you're beginning and starting to understand how to do the skill, you're better off creating a training environment that has execution occurring in a more closed environment, and then you can progress performers through to a more open game-like environment. Our final slide in this first little presentation talks about fundamental movement skills. So what we say is we have these group of fundamental movement skills, so we divide it into 3. Stability skills, which are skills in balancing your body and controlling your body. Locomotor skills, which are the skills of being able to move through space, not space up in the sky space, but just open space around on the ground. So walking, running, jumping are all forms of locomotion. And manipulative skills, being able to control an object either through catching it, throwing it, kicking it, or striking it with some sort of bat. So they're what we call our three categories of fundamental movement skills. And if you look at this diagram down the bottom, this table tells you the 7 fundamental movement skills are throwing, catching, running, kicking, jumping, striking, agility, balance, coordination. So these are the skills that if you were to go to a primary school and watch their PE program, if you were to go to maybe Auskick or an equivalent program for other young kids somewhere, I know my daughter, who's 2, almost 3, goes to something called mini sports. And the sorts of things they're doing in those environments are really simple activities that are getting the kids to run, to jump. Also to strike off, maybe off like a little witch's hat, to learn how to catch, to learn how to throw. And the reason is those fundamental movement skills, there's not a single skill in a sport that you would be able to think of, I'd challenge you to think of one, where that skill isn't just an advanced version of these fundamental movement skills down here. So, and that's why we call them fundamental. They're fundamental, they build the base of all of the other more advanced sport-specific skills, such as tennis serving. You know, if you're serving in tennis, as you're hitting the ball, that is a modified version of throwing, that movement. Baseball pitch, javelin throw, they're all actually examples of throwing. So for that reason, it's super important that you actually get skills, you get students, get children performing and becoming better at these fundamental movement skills as young as you possibly can. Because if you don't, and you guys have been in plenty of PE classes, I would imagine, where you see some students that aren't so capable with catching and throwing and kicking, it makes it really hard to participate in sport. It makes it so hard to participate in sport, it's probably not that fun, and you're probably not very confident. And if you don't find it enjoyable and you're not confident, well, you're less likely to do it. And as you get older and older and have more choice as to whether you're physically active or not, you refrain from being physically active, and that's certainly not something that is healthy for an individual and not something that we want to happen.